Hello, and welcome to Chronicles of the Doomed. I want you to imagine a child. This child is being dangled out of a window by the scruff of his neck. An adult is quite literally holding this child's life in his hand, seeking to get some sort of reaction out of him. Though he faces the prospect of imminent death, this child remains silent and impassive, unwilling to speak, even to beg for his life. The adult, taken aback by the sheer force of this child's will, pulls him out of the window and puts him back on his feet. Now, this story, whether or not it actually happened, is meant to demonstrate the character of the man the child grew into. Before the modern age, childhood did not exist in the way it does now. Children were viewed basically as stunted adults. For historians, they were blank slates that their future selves could be projected onto. And for such a story to be told about his childhood, the man he grew up to be must have been quite formidable indeed. The child's name was Cato, and he was a Roman. Cato's early life was inseparable from the political situation in ancient Rome. The Republic, which had come to govern most of the Mediterranean basin, was falling into disarray. Civil war was becoming rampant as political quarrels between the rich and poor grew ever more violent, and Rome's subject peoples demanded representation in the government. Meanwhile, the politicians in Rome tried to win the favor of the downtrodden in order to gain power for themselves. The man who was dangling Cato out of the window was an Italian politician named Syme. He wanted Cato to try and convince his uncle to support his cause. Cato's uncle, who had taken care of the young child due to the death of his parents, was a politician by the name of Marcus Livius Drusus. Drusus was a tribune, given the task of defending the rights of the plebeians, the average citizens of Rome. Drusus wanted to give the Italian people Roman citizenship, allowing them to participate in elections. In addition to easing the tensions between Rome and its subjects, these Italians would have become loyal supporters of Drusus and would lend considerable clout when he sought higher office in the future. The Senate, however, was having none of this. For years, they had jealously safeguarded their control of the political system, and they were not about to give it up now for some ambitious tribune. In addition, the average citizens of Rome disliked this plan, as their citizenship was perceived as being less valuable if more people possessed it. In the past, they had simply killed off any would-be reformer when they got too troublesome, and Drusus was no exception. He was assassinated in his home, and peace among the Italians died with him. The Italians, having had enough of peaceful agitation, united in a full-blown revolt against Rome. Cato had lost his uncle, and Rome was plunged into civil war. The war only ended when the Romans granted the Italian allies citizenship, something that they had peacefully lobbied for decades. As Cato grew into an adolescent, the fortunes of the Roman Republic declined even further. The generals, Marius and Sulla, each representing a powerful political faction, fought for the ultimate prize of supremacy in Rome. What started as a conflict between the two, over a military command in the east, escalated into a full-blown civil war, with both factions purging their enemies' supporters. Sulla eventually won out, taking the city of Rome and naming himself dictator. He proscribed his political enemies, listing their names publicly and offering money for their deaths. Cato was able to see the horror and lawlessness of this period firsthand, as noble Romans met their deaths, often for no other reason than being distantly related to Marius or his supporters. These purges had a profound effect on Cato that we can see through the rest of his actions. Cato's immediate reaction to the proscriptions seemed to be one of violence. We have stories of Cato actually asking his slave for a sword so that he could kill Sulla himself. And this wasn't just an idle boast. Cato actually knew Sulla. The dictator invited Cato to his home on several occasions, and Cato was able to see the condemned delivered to Sulla's home. It got to the point where Cato's slave had to pat him down for weapons regularly so that he wouldn't try to kill the dictator. In the long term, Cato became obsessed with following the letter of the law and sought refuge in the past, idealizing the Romans of earlier generations. Many of us look to the past in times of adversity, thinking of times that were perhaps better, free of the torment and strife that face us in the here and now. This was quite common in ancient times, as people tended to think of the past as a golden age. The story of the Garden of Eden was a variation of this same trend. Rob Goodman, in his biography of Cato, writes, "The Romans of Cato's day felt themselves 12 times weaker than their ancestors. The ancients were, almost by definition, purer, wiser, braver." Unlike other Romans, though, Cato actively sought to manifest the perceived glory days of Rome through emulation of his ancestors. The ancestor he saw as his role model was also named Cato. This was Cato the Elder, Cato's great-grandfather. To quote Charles Oman, "It was in imitating his ancestor that Cato learned to despise all fine raiment, to such an extent that he habitually dressed in somber colors. He would sit in the tribunal without his shoes, refuse to ride when going about on public missions with his friends, and would not wear a hat even when he was marching across Africa in midsummer." Close quote. Cato modeled his life on the example set by his great-grandfather, to the point of eccentricity. This was a man who represented the traditional Roman virtues, and influenced Cato's lifestyle probably more than any living man. This elder Cato was also a man who had lobbied the Romans of another generation to destroy their ancient enemy, the city of Carthage. Once this enemy was defeated, however, the Romans had no major enemies in the Mediterranean and began to turn on one another. Cato became interested in philosophy as he grew older, favoring the Stoic school. The Stoics believed that to obtain harmony, one should sublimate emotion to reason. Like many Roman nobles of that time period, Cato traveled alongside Greek philosophers, among whom he would stay up all night, drinking wine and discussing the finer points of philosophy. Cato's drinking habits stood out amongst his otherwise sterling reputation. As Cato became a man, he worked his way up the Roman political system. Like all good Roman nobles, he served for a few years in the military, surveying the provinces of the Roman East. Cato was known as a harsh but fair commander, punishing his troops harshly for infractions, but living and working simply alongside them. His troops loved him, despite his strict adherence to the law. During Cato's military service, his brother Caepio, who was closer to Cato than anyone else, died. In his grief for his brother, Cato showed the only extravagance in his otherwise frugal life. He spent lavishly on Caepio's funeral, wishing to honor the man he had loved so dearly in life. This was, strictly speaking, in violation of the Stoic ethic of emotional detachment, but I think Cato can be forgiven for this all-too-relatable display of grief. Soon after, Cato returned to Rome, obtaining the office of quaestor, an official that was responsible for the state's finances. Now, Cato still held his grudge against Sulla, who had stained the young man's career with tyranny and bloodshed. By that time, however, Sulla had died, not at the hand of Cato, but of natural causes. Cato contented himself by prosecuting those who had profited from Sulla's purge, auditing them to regain the money given to them by Sulla. In this way, he exorcised the grudges felt by many Romans against Sulla, removing the last vestiges of the dictator's memory in the Roman political system. In addition to his prosecution of Sulla's partisans, Cato set himself up as a role model for Roman officials. He was known to be unimpeachably honest, avoiding the theft that plagued the lower levels of the bureaucracy. However, Cato was but one man, living in an exceptionally corrupt time. His lofty example could not dissuade other men from falling back on old habits. Once he left office, the quaestors continued on much as they had before, Cato's scrupulous honesty being the aberration rather than the rule. At this point, a quote from Cicero comes to mind, describing Cato. He acts like he lives in Plato's Republic, not Romulus's shit heap. Cato, continuing his way up the Roman political ladder, achieved the office of tribune, a position of considerable influence. During his term, the Roman state was once again faced with considerable adversity as a disgruntled politician named Carlin launched a plot to take over the city of Rome. Along with the accomplished orator Cicero, Cato stood for the immediate execution of all those involved with the plot. During this period of crisis for the Republic, Julius Caesar first enters our narrative. The young senator, in opposition to Cato, argued for clemency for the accused, suggesting that the conspirators should be held to await trial. Cato argued that the proof of their guilt would only be found if they succeeded in overthrowing the government. Only a demonstration of firm resolve would deter Catiline and his comrades. During the proceedings, Cato saw an aide sneak a note to Caesar. Cato, suspicious of Caesar's appeal for clemency, claimed he was in league with the conspirators and demanded to read Caesar's note. To his horror, he soon discovered it was a love letter to Caesar from Cato's sister. Despite this personal humiliation, Cato won out, the conspirators received the death penalty, and the crisis was averted. However, a rivalry between Cato and Caesar was born, one that would shape both of their lives. In this period, however, the major perceived threat to the Republic was Pompey, the ambitious young general who had conquered the eastern Mediterranean. Cato may have distrusted Pompey, at least initially, due to his association with Sulla, the tyrannical dictator who haunted Cato's past. Pompey, the greatest general of that time, scared the old guard in Rome, as he began to ask the Senate for considerable favors. Pompey wanted to be able to run for the consulship. The consulship was the highest political position in Rome. There were 2 elected every year, and it was required that the candidate run for office while within the city. Pompey wanted the Senate to allow him to run for the consulship while he was outside of the city. Many of the senators wanted to grant this request, but Cato urged them to refuse. Pompey was forced to choose between having a triumph or running for consul. The triumph was a kind of parade held by the Romans to honor great military victories. The victorious general was treated like a king for a day, painting his face red to resemble the Roman god Jupiter. Pompey, tellingly, chose the triumph, preferring pomp and circumstance to actual power. Julius Caesar, however, was cut from a different cloth. When given the same decision, he chose to run for the consulship. Cato, distrusting Caesar greatly, put forward his friend Bibulus to run for the consulship also. This election was fraught with bribery, and for the first time, Cato encouraged bribing the voters in order to win Bibulus the consulship. To Cato, frustrating the designs of Caesar was more important than behaving in a strictly honorable fashion, at least in this case. In the end, both Bibulus and Caesar were elected consul, creating what we would call a divided government, wherein 2 competing factions hold power together. Caesar and Cato belonged to 2 separate political factions in Rome. Now, these weren't political parties as we would think of them today, more factions that were often more personal than political in nature. Cato's faction, the Optimates, claimed to be defending the Republic and the traditions of Rome, which meant that they supported the privileges of the Senate and the aristocracy. Caesar's faction, the Populares, supported the common people and sought to distribute land amongst the urban poor. Oddly enough, Cato belonged to the same faction as the dictator Sulla. Politics makes for strange bedfellows indeed. To block Caesar, Cato made use of the filibuster, a stalling tactic that has seen use in the United States Congress as well as the Roman Senate. He talked for hours and hours to stop Caesar's programs from being enacted, enraging him to the point of violating the law to get what he wanted. On one such occasion, when Caesar was trying to distribute land among Pompey's veterans, Cato pushed him to the breaking point. Caesar had Cato forcibly removed from the Senate House in order to silence him. The senators, alarmed at Caesar's treatment of an esteemed colleague, walked out, leaving Caesar alone in the Senate House. When Caesar saw a close friend of his leaving, he inquired as to what he was doing. The man looked back at Caesar and said, "I'd rather be in prison with Cato than here with you." Caesar was eventually able to get his bill passed by appealing to the people of Rome, and added an addendum which forced senators to swear an oath supporting it on penalty of exile. Cato considered exile, but as Cicero aptly put it, Cato may not have needed Rome, but Rome still needed Cato. Cato's true fame came as he fought against the powerful men in Rome, who had united to monopolize power amongst themselves. These were Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. The first two have been introduced, but Crassus has not yet entered the narrative. He was a Roman politician and businessman, and served as the financier for the other two men. These three became known to history as the Triumvirate. In these men, Cato must have seen many a Sulla, overly ambitious generals who would use the force of arms to override the rule of law. The Triumvirs knew that their power would never be secure as long as Cato continued to reside in Rome, serving as a beacon that the Optimates could rally behind. They chose one of their own, a tribune by the name of Clodius Pulcher, to send Cato to annex the island of Cyprus in the eastern Mediterranean. Cato saw this for what it was, a gilded exile. Cato would toil harmlessly while Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus ran Rome as they saw fit. Despite his reduced position, he served admirably, extracting a large amount of money for the Roman treasury. Once Cato returned to Rome, he resumed his old habits, working to thwart the plans of the Triumvirate wherever possible. While Cato was in Cyprus, Crassus had been given a command in Syria, while Pompey controlled Spain. Caesar was given control of a province in Gaul, in what is now southern France. He waged war on the tribes of Rome's northern frontier, conquering large amounts of territory and becoming extremely wealthy. In 53 BCE, Crassus died while invading Persia, leading to a break within the Triumvirate. Pompey's wife, who was Caesar's daughter, had died the previous year, severing the last link between the two men. At this time, Rome was rife with violence, as rival gang leaders vied for control, fighting each other in the streets. Cato, swallowing his pride, made common cause with Pompey, encouraging him to stem the violence in the streets with the aid of his army. At this time, we see that Pompey is moving, slowly but steadily, into the camp of the Senate and out of Caesar's. In 52 BC, Cato ran for the highest office in Roman politics, the consulship. Cato refused to bribe the voters or even to vigorously campaign, as he felt that he should not act against his character to gain power. This is one of Cato's more frustrating acts. At the point where he could have been in a position to further his political ends, he did virtually nothing to gain office. Now, around this time, Caesar won the Battle of Alesia, pacifying Gaul and eliminating the last resistance to Roman rule there. The Gallic War was over, and Caesar's term of office was about to expire. As he basked in his victory, many in the Roman Senate clamored for his return to Italy, and not so that he could celebrate a triumph. Cato desired to prosecute Caesar for his illegal invasion of Gaul. Cato felt that the Romans should fear Caesar, not the disorganized tribes of the far north. In Cato's opinion, Caesar should be surrendered to the Gallic tribes he had fought against so that they could decide his fate. God only knows what that might have been. Caesar knew that once he returned to Rome, he could be prosecuted for his conduct in Gaul and the laws he had broken while consul in Rome. During the years of 50 and 49 BCE, numerous attempts were made to reconcile Pompey and Caesar, with Cato advocating for a hard line against his long-term. During the years of 50 and 49 BCE, numerous attempts were made to reconcile Pompey and Caesar, with Cato advocating for a hard line against his longtime enemy. While the two politicians fought over disbanding their respective armies in the interest of peace, Cato ceaselessly argued for Caesar's ruin, stating that Pompey would be a fool to trust him. Charles Oman writes, quoting Cato, "You took him upon your shoulders 8 years ago, and now you begin to find him heavy. You can neither support his weight nor cast him off. Probably you will both fall together, and in your fall crush the Republic." End quote. Cato was more correct than even he might have realized. The talks broke down as Caesar marched south, as some in Rome believed that he had already declared war on the Senate. Caesar was declared an enemy of the state, and soon after, he crossed the Rubicon River, the traditional boundary of Italy. It was illegal to cross this river with an army, and his action was an implicit declaration of war. It is no coincidence that crossing the Rubicon has come to mean crossing the point of no return. At this point, Cato had been vindicated for his distrust of Caesar, who had finally shown himself to be another Sulla, dragging Rome into the ignominy of civil war. Caesar proved to be more formidable than Pompey and Cato had bargained for, charging down the peninsula to Rome before anyone could prepare for him. Cato, Pompey, and the Senate fled to the east, gathering armies with the hopes of reclaiming Rome. From this point on, Cato begins to act as if he is in mourning, growing his hair out and dressing even more somber than usual. Whatever the result, Cato had to contend against his fellow Romans, and Rome would be weaker no matter who was victorious. Cato was a respected member of Pompey's army, but was given few responsibilities. It was feared that Cato would eventually oppose Pompey, and so he was relegated to a supporting role defending the supplies. Pompey suffered a massive defeat at the Battle of Pharsalus, losing his army and driving many senators, such as Cicero, into the hands of Caesar. Pompey fled to Egypt, while Cato and his allies went to Africa. Pompey was soon thereafter killed by the Egyptians, leaving Cato as one of Caesar's few remaining enemies among the Romans. Cato led his men through the scorching deserts of Africa, building an army in the city of Utica. Caesar landed in Africa shortly thereafter, and the Republic's forces were soon routed at the Battle of Thapsus. When the survivors from the battle began to pour into Utica, it became known that the cause was lost, and that Caesar was bearing down upon them. Cato's family and friends, knowing Caesar's reputation for clemency, urged him to ask Caesar for a pardon, but Cato refused. In his mind, Caesar was a tyrant and had no right to pardon him or anyone else. Oman writes, "To fight was useless, perhaps even harmful. To surrender was dishonorable. It only remained to die." End quote. Cato spent the next few days helping his allies escape from the city by any means available to them. On his last night, Cato enjoyed a meal with his friends and family, discussing philosophy and embracing his son more warmly than usual. Before going to bed, Cato asked for the Phaedo, Plato's account of the death of Socrates. Up late reading, he found that his sword was missing. He cried aloud that he had been betrayed to Caesar. His son entered the room, begging his father not to commit suicide. Cato was determined, however, and sent his son out of the room. Cato's household could not match his resolve, and they eventually relented, sending a young slave in with a requested blade. Cato, satisfied that the sword was sharp enough, plunged it into his belly, but he was unable to strike a killing blow. His household heard him and burst into the room, frantically trying to stitch the wounds, but Cato tore them open and died. The people of Utica, upon hearing of his death, cried and mourned for him, calling him the only free man. To the Stoics, only the good man is truly free, and to the Uticans, Cato was the best of men. In dying, Cato won a moral victory over Caesar by martyring himself for the Republic. Caesar took Cato's suicide personally and would hold a grudge against him for the rest of his life. Upon his return to Italy, Caesar staged a triumph in Rome, celebrating his victories in the Civil War. He built giant, gaudy floats to depict the enemies that he had defeated. One of these depicted Cato's death, and we are told that when the Romans saw him depicted in such a fashion, they groaned aloud and wept bitter tears. Cato was a symbol to them. He represented old Roman values, and the insensitive depiction of his death opened fresh wounds. Caesar later published a hit piece on the dead statesman, entitled The Anti-Cato. Caesar overplayed his hand, and his attack on Cato backfired. As Rob Goodman writes, "There is little to gain in attacking a dead man, and much to lose." End quote. Cicero and the other hardcore Republicans in the Senate churned out copies of the Anti-Cato as a means of attacking Caesar. Cato's most ardent supporters, including his nephew Brutus, were the nucleus of the plot against Caesar's life, which came to fruition on the 15th of March, 44 BCE. After the end of the Republic, Cato's ghost hung over Roman politics for many years. He became a kind of secular saint, lionized by writers, historians, and poets alike. In the 18th century, Joseph Addison wrote the play Cato, which immortalized the Roman statesman on stage, portraying his last days in Utica. Later, revolutionaries, such as George Washington, looked to Cato as an example of the model Republican. In fact, during the darkest days of the American Revolution, George Washington had the play Cato performed for his troops to inspire them to fight on for the new American Republic. The reason I chose to talk about Cato was that I believe that in many ways he sets a moral example for us. He captured the imagination of historians, not for the battles he won or the nations he conquered, but for the way he led his life. I believe we can all find something to admire in him. I would like to end this with a quote from Rob Goodman. His whole life, Cato portrayed himself as the Republic embodied, the last repository of its ancient liberty and virtue. In this sense, he was Rome's last citizen. This has been Chronicles of the Doomed. Thank you for listening.